What's in an idea? An idea is something that can be born in your head, but if you do nothing about it, it will never become a reality. Today we'll tell you about a man whose hard work proved that when there's great desire, an idea can be made into reality, born out of great faith in one's strengths and abilities. The protagonist of our story was born on February 24th, 1955. His life didn't really work out from the very beginning. When he was little, his own mother abandoned him and gave him up for adoption. However, he wasn't there for long, and soon he had a new family. He was adopted by a married couple, Paul and Clara Jobs. They couldn't have children of their own, so they made the decision to adopt someone else's child and raise them as their own. When he got to their family, Clara and Paul named their adopted son Steve. Surprisingly, Steve was a very gifted boy, uniquely combining incredible enthusiasm, curiosity, and great research abilities. Time passed. Steve was growing up an ordinary boy, but when he was about 12 years old, both he and his parents noticed that he was fascinated by electronics. One day, Steve decided to prove himself by expressing a desire to help his physics teacher in assembling an electric current frequency sensor for the classroom. Even being adults, most of us have no idea what those words mean, but even back then, it was all very interesting for Steve. The only thing in his way was the lack of necessary equipment and parts, and most of us would have just given up at this point, but not Steve. The boy found a rather unusual solution. He took a phone book and simply called William Hewlett. Having heard this name, most of you probably understood that the person on the other end of the line was the general director of the well-known company HP. Can you imagine that? A 12-year-old boy didn't give up, but rather plucked up his courage and called someone who could have simply laughed in his face and ended the conversation without even listening to what the boy had to say. But Steve impressed William. After a 20-minute conversation, William sent over his driver with all the necessary parts, seeing their dialogue as very entertaining. And in the late spring, Steve got an internship at HP at the personal invitation of William. While still in school, he made friends with someone who shared his interests so they could do what they loved to do together. Electronics was their common hobby, so both Steves, Jobs, and Wozniak could solder something for days on end. Later, they both attended lectures and had an internship at HP. After finishing school, Wozniak went to work at this company, but as an engineer. Anyone who loves their job and immerses themselves in it, giving it their soul, all their strength and time, dreams of something. Wozniak dreamed of creating his own personal computer. Jobs, on the other hand, chose a different path and decided not to work for the same firm, but rather joined Atari as a video game designer. However, the young man's enthusiasm quickly faded. So Steve decided to leave and simply drop everything. Instead, he chose the path of enlightenment and went to India with his hippie friends. As he later said, "Those were the days when everything felt boring. I wanted to buy a one-way ticket and disappear. It was the time for rebirth, vital for getting new and fresh ideas." Jobs remained in the States and became one of the founders of the Home Brew Computer Club, known only in close circles of radio amateurs. But Jobs' work had its results. In 1975, Wozniak finally finished what he'd been working on for a long time. He proudly showed his first prototype of a personal computer to a company which he worked at during his school years. But unfortunately, and to Wozniak's great disappointment, it didn't go as planned, and his brainchild didn't get approved. Wozniak was very upset, but he didn't stop and tried turning to Atari, where his friend had once worked as a designer. But to his even greater disappointment, the company also rejected Wozniak's invention, considering it as a non-profitable venture. As Wozniak himself recalled, "People always tend to doubt something new. My invention was no exception at the time." Having failed because of simple fear of the other people, those who prefer stability that brings income and tend to reject new ideas, Steve Wozniak was at a loss. He could no longer work for those companies since he didn't see the point anymore. His brainchild, which he spent several years developing, was just made fun of. No one knows what would have happened to the crushed and humiliated Wozniak if the prodigal son didn't decide to return from India. Of course, the first thing he did was visit his friend, who told Jobs all about his invention and its failure. That evening, they talked for a long time, analyzing all the options. Plucking up his courage, Jobs proposed that they go their own, independent way and establish their own company. It was then that the two young men no one knew much about decided to take a new path in their lives. And as it turned out many years later, it was the path to success. On April 1st, 1976, sitting at home with his friends, Steve was thinking about India and listing all the possible names for their company. And since Jobs got interested in an apple diet after returning from India, he suggested naming the company Apple. Jobs was smart about it too, as he clearly understood that the first letters of this name would guarantee them a phone book position before Atari. And since there was no internet at the time, it was the phone book that connected people with companies. It was also then that the first company logo was invented, depicting Newton sitting under an apple tree. But their company existed on paper only. They needed a product, and an amazing one at that. Thus, the first personal computer developed by Wozniak, the one that had been rejected by both HP and Atari, became their first product. Apple I was the name of their brainchild, which required the first serious sacrifice and investment from Jobs, for which he even sold his beloved van. The young men managed to scrape up $1,300. It was a crucial investment in the company's very first product. They had to start somewhere, and most importantly, if they did decide to start, they couldn't do it out on the streets. Having no alternatives at the time, the team decided to headquarter at Jobs' home. Steve lived with his parents back then, so Clara Jobs didn't stand aside and joined her son's team. She acted as an assistant who answered calls, which helped the company's image, making it look like a serious organization. Each company faces an endless battle with competition, and so the trio faced their first competition, the Altair 8800. This device was assembled by hand and had toggle switches, which were used to enter commands. The results were presented by a combination of front panel lights. The more difficult the task, the more switches were required. Sometimes the number of switches could even reach over 100. If a mistake was made, the user received inaccurate calculations and had to start all over again. But at the time, such a computer was perfect for scientists and those who wanted to touch the future. Apple I, on the other hand, outperformed the competitor at the very least by having a keyboard for input and also a display, which showed the results. No matter how funny it may sound, some of the first samples of Apple I were put together right in Steve's bedroom. They had no machines, modeling equipment, or anything else. Just a bedroom, their own hands, minds, and imagination. That's all they had. But where could they sell this miracle device? They were faced with their first significant problem. No one wanted to buy the unknown product. They were rejected by every store they brought their invention to. Only one store agreed to take their product, but on the condition that they get paid if it sells. However, to everyone's surprise, the novel device got sold out in just a week. That's when they realized that there wasn't enough room for them to grow production. So they decided to move into Jobs' garage. The Apple I computer sold for $666.66. This amount wasn't chosen by accident. It was Wozniak's idea, but otherwise, Jobs was in charge of all the sales issues. The very first 100 computers were sold to local customers, making a decent contribution to Apple's first budget. But for the company to grow and increase production, new funds were needed, but they were sorely lacking. This task was also taken on by Jobs. Wozniak and the team were mostly engaged in the production and technical side of the project, while everything related to money and promotion was Jobs' responsibility. There were moments when Jobs was ready to give up. They even came close to stopping production due to a lack of funding. At one point, Jobs even stopped talking to people and didn't leave his room for days, calling banks in search of funding. but they all rejected his request. But when there was almost no hope left, Steve did manage to find the right person who invested in the project. Thus, the company's budget was replenished by $92,000 and a little later by an additional $250,000 through a credit line at Bank of America. The team felt their success growing, and each member was pleased with their advancement. Jobs was extremely proud of the progress and implementation of each of their ideas, and there was nothing stopping Wozniak from finally doing what he loved most, developing new products without the limitation of a small budget. Thus, in 1980, Apple II saw the light of day. The modified model included color graphics. Wozniak also added the Disk 2 controller, the simplest DOS, as well as the file system. Needless to say, the brand new Apple II made an impression. It was this model that brought millions to the company and its owners, and finally opened the company's way to the American Stock Exchange. But life is unpredictable. For every up, there is a down. In 1981, Wozniak's plane crashed during takeoff. Incredibly, he survived, but the development of new products had to be stopped during the duration of his rehabilitation, which took 2 years. The problem was that Wozniak suffered from amnesia and didn't remember anything about what he'd been doing before. After the incident, Jobs was in no hurry to return to work either. He decided to take his time to study under a fake name. But in 1983, he returned to the company, where he began to develop innovative projects again. Issuing shares just didn't mark a new stage in development for the company, but also brought Jobs a feeling of a significant discomfort. That was because Steve was a leader by nature, but since the company's working capital was on loan, the board of directors didn't allow Jobs to feel like he had a leading role. They were in charge, and the ingenious founder of the company felt like he was just one of the company's managers. Steve's most important and distinguishing trait was his insanely powerful energy, capable of motivating a circle of people interested in a common cause. He was great at inspiring and communicating all of his ideas to everyone. Steve was constantly striving for a leading position, and this led him to success in the Macintosh project. The project made him the idol of many engineers, employees, and everyone else in the industry. A friend of Bill Gates once shared that he even bought a Macintosh and was actively using it. Steve's growing ideology, with a passionate desire to create a flawless product, exerted tremendous pressure on the entire staff. He got the most they were capable of out of every person on the team. He was completely fixated on work and success. Jobs even spent his nights at the office so as not to waste time on the commute home and back. As tensions on the market were rising and competition was growing, Jobs got an idea to hire the former director of the well-known company Pepsi, John Sculley, for a management position at Apple. He was a successful top manager who had proven himself to be excellent at marketing. But this idea turned out to be a big mistake. Jobs brought a rival into the company who didn't just have different views on how to manage the firm, but it was his initiative that got the board of directors to fire Jobs in 1985. After Jobs left the company, things were still good for a while. They had Steve's remaining developments, and for the next 12 years, they developed and promoted their own operating system, which made it possible to stay afloat. A serious problem for the company was the rapid decline in the value of the shares. People even argued about which of the current market giants would acquire the remains of the well-known company. Meanwhile, Steve didn't waste time either. He directed all of his efforts on promoting his new brainchild, the Next company. It was for this purpose that Jobs worked on developing his own operating system and creating a computer for scientific purposes. You'll be surprised, but the famous Pixar was also under Jobs' management at the time. And that's when the studio released such hits like Toy Story and Monsters Incorporated. Steve's work and the productive top management brought the company to unprecedented heights. And on December 20th, 1996, Apple decided to buy Next for $429 million. Just think about this amount. But they had one condition: Jobs would return to the company as the CEO. Under his leadership, many staff members were fired and outdated developments were discarded. Jobs couldn't stop thinking that he wouldn't have been so successful if he didn't get fired from Apple in the first place and put in a position where he felt extreme pressure to succeed. It was a very important experience, which gave Jobs an understanding of what he needed to do to succeed. The first iMac was launched on August 15, 1998, and right after that, the famous OS X was developed. A year later, iBook was introduced to the world, which shared iMac's design. If you look at it now, it seems rather strange, but it was the top product back then. The company made a revolution in the music industry in 2001. It was then that the first iPod was introduced to the world, and the first Apple stores were opened. The iPod became the best-selling player due to its design, convenience, size, and ease of use. Following the iPod, the iTunes Store was introduced in 2003. Jobs was the first one to offer the world to buy music by the track and made it possible to listen to it any time on a computer or on an iPod. It was obviously a whole new level of technology, which would provide a completely new experience to its users. Steve redefined the classic input method when he introduced the touchscreen. Now we're getting to the most important moment in the brand's history: the introductory presentation of the very first iPhone in 2007. It was an unprecedented breakthrough. A couple of taps and you could have access to any function you might need. To this day, this presentation is considered an icon of public speaking, showcasing Steve's talent. A year later, in 2008, MacBook Air was introduced to the world. Thin, lightweight, quite autonomous, with the most durable case and the well-known hinge, which allowed opening the laptop lid with just one finger. Steve wasn't going to stop there and presented the first iPad in 2010. In August 2011, the company was declared the most expensive company in the world. It is this achievement that allowed Steve to announce his resignation to the whole world. He got everything he could have ever dreamed of. Jobs gave his seat to Tim Cook, who became the chairman of the board of directors. Today, Apple is the market leader on all continents. In just one quarter of 2019, Apple's revenue was $64 billion. And there's hardly anyone on the planet who doesn't know this brand. Steve Jobs and his brainchild proved to the world that nothing is impossible, and no matter how difficult and thorny the path is, if you give in fully to your dream, you will succeed. In 2003, Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but even being sick, he still devoted most of his time to his favorite work. Steve Jobs died of respiratory failure at about 3 p.m. on August 5, 2011 at his home in California. He died surrounded by his loved ones, his wife, children, and sisters. According to his family, Jobs died peacefully, and his last words, spoken a few hours before his death, were, "Oh wow." Having learned this man's story, it's difficult to imagine that an ordinary man named Steve Jobs could have become an icon of public speaking and a genius of his generation for millions of people around the world. Every genius idea initially comes to someone's mind, and it's up to that person to decide what to do about it and how to make their dreams come true. So friends, let us know what you think about this person and his invention. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.